In the weeks after the Dutch Grand Prix, the Space Shuttle Discovery made its maiden flight at the fourth try after 3 scrubbed attempts and landed safely at Edwards Air Force Base after putting 3 satellites in orbit. While it was up, the Canadian people went to the polls and elected Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Party to form the new government with a huge majority, including taking a majority of seats in Quebec, which had long been a Liberal stronghold. Author Truman Capote died at age 59 of liver disease complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. He'd been staying with his old friend Joanne Carson, Johnny Carson's ex, in Los Angeles at the time. Capote was probably best known for his novels Breakfast at Tiffany's of 1958 and the true crime novel In Cold Blood, 1966. Also, just after the Dutch race, the Tyrrell team's appeal against their ban was heard, and, to nobody's great surprise, the ban was upheld. The team would therefore not take part in the remaining 3 races of the season and lost all the points that they had gained so far. Stefan Bellof, at least, still had his Porsche racing team, and Martin Brundle's ankles needed some more time to heal fully, but Stefan Johansson was left at something of a loose end. Or he would have been, were it not for events elsewhere. On the day after the Zandvoort race, Ayrton Senna had put pen to paper on a 2-year contract with Lotus, and Peter War's team put out a press release the next day announcing the big news. Unfortunately, Ayrton hadn't had time to notify his current boss, Alex Hawkridge, who didn't take too kindly to finding out that way, and his mood wasn't helped by what he saw as the rather patronising tone of the Lotus press release, which reaffirmed that Senna would of course see out the season with Tolman. So Hawkridge took the unusual step of suspending Senna for 1 race and hiring Stefan Johansson in his place. And because this was Italy and sponsors Segafredo wanted an Italian in the car, the team briefly returned to a 2-car lineup to give an F1 debut to 1983 F3 champion Pierluigi Martini. Pierluigi Martini's uncle Giancarlo was a racing driver too, driving in Formula 2 during the 1970s, mostly for the Scuderia Everest team run by his good friend Giancarlo Minardi. Everest also entered him in 2 non-championship F1 races in 1976, driving a customer Ferrari 312T chassis, and he came home 10th at Silverstone in the BRDC International Trophy. Young Pierluigi was naturally bitten by the racing bug, but found it difficult to get established in European Formula 3, making 3 starts for Trivellato in 1981, 2 starts for Pavesi in 1982, before finally getting a full-time drive with Pavesi for 1983, and putting in a great late-season surge to win the title with 4 wins and a 2nd place in the last 5 races, beating Dane John Nielsen to the title at the last race at Croisson-Ternois. During that 1983 season, Giancarlo Minardi gave him a single drive at the wheel of the F2 car, but decided not to offer him a seat for 1984, so Pierluigi moved into sports car racing, by happy coincidence ending up at the Jolly Club Lancia team sponsored by the Martini Drinks Company, no relation, and drove alongside Formula Azella driver Beppe Gabbiani and French veteran Xavier Lapierre at Le Mans. However, his F3 championship had nonetheless put him on the map for single-seaters, and his personal sponsors got him a seat at Tolman for the Italian Grand Prix to try and raise his profile. Meanwhile, Gerhard Berger had raised some more sponsorship to see out the season with ATS and was back here, making it a 27-car field once again, even with the absence of the Tyrrells, and Hub Rottengatter had got 1 more race with Spirit after some more sponsorship problems for Mauro Baldi. The atmosphere in Italy leading up to the race at Monza was grim. In the spring, the fans flocked to Imola in the wake of Alboretto's maiden Ferrari win at Zolder, but it had proved a false dawn, and the rest of the season hadn't been so much fun for the tifosi to watch. Perhaps the biggest sign that all was not well at Maranello was when Enzo Ferrari himself gave a press conference expressing that the team management, technical staff and drivers all had his full confidence and support. Ouch. Whether by coincidence or not, several people noticed that Alboretto had a new engineer, while neither Mauro Forghieri nor Harvey Postlethwaite were anywhere to be seen at the track. The fans just had to hope that they were busy working on next year's car rather than having a sulk or worse. Ferrari were one of a number of teams trying out the McLaren rear end, where the side pods tucked in like a waist and a rising undershield under the rear suspension. Williams had done it earlier in the season, and now the Prancing Horse and Alfa Romeo had also come up with their own versions, leading one wag to suggest that John Barnard was selling conversion kits on the side. Barnard himself just smiled and said, "They haven't got it quite right, but it's not a bad attempt." On Friday there were all the usual technical niggles, including a hair-raising crash for Winkelhock, whose worn-out drive shaft broke, came loose, thrashed around, broke his rear suspension and threw him into the barriers. Gartner and the second Azella also clipped a barrier and had a pretty nasty off. Both drivers were fine, thankfully. The morning practice session ended with a sprinkle of rain, but it dried up once the afternoon qualifying got underway, and if they'd cared about anyone not in a Ferrari, the Italians might have come away with a smile on their faces, with De Angelis first, then Piquet, then Fabi and Alboreto for 3 Italians in the top 4. Saturday qualifying was hotter, and almost everyone improved their time, with Piquet going out early, knocking a 1.5 seconds off his Friday time, then sitting back and watching everyone else try and fail to beat it. So Nelson Piquet took his 7th pole of the year ahead of Prost, with De Angelis 3rd once more, and Lauda alongside, despite a strained back that gave him so much pain he was in tears at the end of the session. Fabi was an excellent 5th, seemingly improving all the time at Brabham, although rumours suggested he wouldn't be kept on for next year. Rosberg was 6th, and his rumoured 1985 teammate Mansell 7th. Then Tombe and the Alfa Romeos making up the top 10. Among the only drivers not to improve his times on Saturday was Alboreto, who would now start 11th, just ahead of Warwick, Lafitte and Arnoux. Johansson in Senna's borrowed Tolman would start 17th, while Pierluigi Martini was bottom of the heap and would be the unlucky non-qualifier. Over 9 seconds off Piquet's time, but a more respectable 0.4 seconds off the back of the grid. There were more car dramas on Sunday morning. Piquet, Prost and Warwick would all start in the spare cars after various engine problems, while De Angelis hadn't often wrenched his shoulder. Manfred Winkelhock had qualified 21st in the spare ATS, but on his way to the grid, the car developed some gearbox troubles and stuttered round. Manfred pulled up on the grid, got out, exchanged a few hot words with Gunter Schmidt and walked off into the pits and out of the circuit. The team were left with no option but to push the car off the track and concentrate on Berger's race. So the 25 remaining cars lined up for the start, and when the lights went green, it was De Angelis, still mathematically in contention for the title, who outdragged both Piquet and Prost to take the lead, but not for long, as Piquet's superior BMW power showed and he took the lead into the first chicane, with Prost 3rd, Tombe 4th after an excellent start, chased by an equally fast starting Mansell. Fabi was 6th, then Patrese, Lauda, who'd had a slipped disc popped back into place and then strapped up by his personal physician Willy Dungel, but was still in pain, and Eddie Cheever. Siri, meanwhile, had pulled into the pits at the end of the parade lap and started the race late from there. Piquet was already pulling away from De Angelis as the field came through to finish the first lap, and Prost pulled out to pass the Lotus with relatively little drama too a short while later, while Mansell was also losing ground, letting Lauda and Patrese pass before retaking the place from the Alfa. Tombe was also past De Angelis into 3rd at the end of lap 2. Piquet had a major slither, kept it on the black bit, but lost ground to Prost, who now had Tombe right behind him, running well in the Renault, while De Angelis had now dropped behind Fabi and lost another place to Lauda, but at that point Prost's engine blew, the 3rd year in a row Alain had been jeered back to the pits by the Tifosi after breaking down, and promoted Tombe and Fabi to 2nd and 3rd, with Lauda 4th, then De Angelis and Alboreto, who was moving quickly up the order too. The top 3 began to pull away from Lauda, who now only needed to finish in the points to increase his lead over Prost, as Arnoux pulled over after just 5 laps of the gearbox failure. Fabi was looking livelier than he had for some time, harrying Tombe for 2nd place, but overcooked it at the Variante della Roggia and lost the rear end. He kept the car going and rejoined well down the order. Meanwhile, the retirements kept coming as De Cesaris's Renault engine blew on the same lap that Hainaut spun out, joining Winkelhock, Prost, Arnoux and Alliot on the casualty list after just 7 laps, with Rosberg having a turbo failure at the start of the next lap. Tombe, meanwhile, was still hanging on Piquet's tail and wouldn't let him get away, with Lauda cruising now in 3rd, then a little cluster of Alboreto, De Angelis, Cheever, Fabi and Warwick in 4th through 7th places, then Mansell and Lafitte having a scrap over 8th, Johansson having come up well to 10th after getting away badly and being right at the back off the start, then Boutsen, then Patrese and Ghinzani fighting over 12th. Fabi wasn't hanging about and quickly made his way past Cheever and De Angelis by lap 10, while Lafitte had got ahead of Mansell and swiftly left him behind, arriving on Cheever's tail instead. The first chicane, Fabi cut past Alboreto to go 4th and set off in pursuit of Lauda and the 3rd place he'd lost with his spin. Lafitte's good run came to an end just afterwards with another blown turbo to match Rosberg's from 2 laps earlier, making it 8 retirements in the first 12 laps. On lap 14, as Tombe continued to stick to the back of Piquet like a sweaty t-shirt, Mansell threw it into the sandpit at the Roggia chicane, and a lap later De Angelis toured off with an attack of the dreaded Lotus gearbox. Fabi had now caught Lauda and was looking for a way past, but the cameras stuck with the leaders, and for once it was a good job, as on lap 16, Piquet's engine started emitting little bursts of smoke. He signalled to the pits as he came past, sounding very rough, as Tambay surged past into the lead. The first time a Renault had led since Warwick did so in Brazil. The Ferrari fans had a soft spot for Patrick Tambay after his successful stint with the team last year, and if a Ferrari couldn't win, he might prove an acceptable substitute. It was certainly better than one of the hated Brabhams. As Riccardo Patrese had found in previous years, Bernie Ecclestone was deeply unpopular with the Tifosi, and even being Italian didn't get you a pass from them. The flurry of retirements had shaken up the order behind the top four: Tambay, Lauda, Fabi and Alboreto. So Chiva was now 5th, with Warwick 6th, Johansson an excellent 7th, and Patrese 8th at the end of lap 16, and Fabi soon made his way past Lauda as they came up to lap Berger's sole ATS. Lauda stuck with Fabi for a few laps, but wasn't inclined to try anything rash and dropped back rather than blow a gasket sticking with the Italian's furious pace. So soon Tambay led Fabi by about 5 seconds, with Lauda another couple behind, and Alboreto some distance back with Warwick now on his tail. Fabi was still charging, and had the gap down to 3.7 seconds a couple of laps later. Then when Tambay made a bit of a meal of lapping Boutsen and Gartner, he was able to close right up with Lauda still not far behind. By the time they came round to the Rettifilo at the start of the lap, Fabi was right under Tambay's rear wing. Lauda, meanwhile, had closed up too, but seemed happy to hang back and see what developed between Tambay and Fabi, safe in the knowledge that even just 4 points from third would do him very nicely indeed. Fabi had a couple of looks at Tambay, but perhaps chastened by his earlier mishap, seemed less inclined to try anything risky, and his tyres were also starting to protest at their treatment. Warwick's oil pressure went back in 5th place, and he parked it before anything more expensive broke, promoting Johansson into the points as he continued an off-screen ding-dong battle with Chiva, who had said before the race that he was just going to keep going until he eventually ran out of fuel, rather than back off or turn down the boost to ensure finishing. Fabi began to drop back from Tambay a little, and Lauda saw his opportunity, making a move on lap 36, but Fabi hadn't come second in last year's IndyCar Championship by pure luck, and slammed the door as they came down to the Rettifilo. The three came by Ghinzani running well in 8th, who went right over the grass to avoid contact, and with just 13 laps to go, the top three were still right together, with Lauda still pressuring Fabi, but Fabi not letting go the back of the Renault. Lauda looked again at the Rettifilo next time round, but got the same answer from Fabi, and again at the Ascari, before finally getting through as they went into the Parabolica at the end of the lap. All this had allowed Tambay to pull out a lead of about 3 seconds over second place, while Fabi began to rapidly drop back on worn tyres and had trouble lapping Patrese's Alfa Romeo. On lap 43, just 9 before the end, Tambay suddenly slowed and Lauda went past into the lead, while Fabi pulled over on the pit straight with a dead BMW. There was cheering from the crowd as Alboreto came past into third, and then before the end of the lap Michele was up to second as Tambay pulled over with a broken throttle. So Lauda now led Alboreto as the only 2 cars on the lead lap, with Chiva a rather distant third, Johansson 4th, Patrese 5th, and Ghinzani 6th, with 5 laps to go. Chiva inevitably pulled off out of fuel shortly before the end, promoting Johansson to third and Gartner into the points, while Johansson was struggling with a gearbox problem and lost 3rd and 4th to Patrese and Ghinzani on lap 48. Johansson had to nearly stand his car on its nose to let Lauda go past and lap him, but regained a place when Ghinzani ran out of fuel on the very last lap. Niki Lauda, almost unnoticed by everyone as cars began to litter the edges of the track, came home to win his 5th Grand Prix of the year and his 24th overall, equalling the total of the great Juan Manuel Fangio, who was in the stands watching. Michele Alboreto finished second to a roar from the crowd who hadn't expected such a good result and really didn't care if it was only because almost everybody else had fallen by the wayside. His fellow Italian in the Italian car nobody cared about, Patrese, was third in the Alfa. Johansson coughed across the line 4th and pulled over just beyond it, out of fuel. Gartner ran out of fuel just before the line, but switched on the electric starter pump which gave his engine one last bump over the line for 5th, and Gerhard Berger came home 6th in just his 2nd Grand Prix, having been without 4th gear for the last third of it. A good day for Italy in the end, with 2nd and 3rd drivers, cars and engines, and a good day for Austria, though neither Gartner or Berger were eligible for points, both driving 2nd cars that hadn't been registered at the start of the season. So Lauda now led the championship by 9.5 points, and could be crowned champion at the next race in a month's time if things went his way. Perhaps fittingly, that race would be the first Formula One race back at the Nürburgring since 1976.